evening. My name is Taylor Randall, and I'm the president here at the University of Utah. It's my pleasure and honor to welcome you to Utah's Museum of Fine Arts and to the Tanner Lectures on Human Values. This is just a spectacular evening. For those of you that have been to these lectures before, to me, it's one of the intellectual highlights of the year. These lectures were started in 1976 by Obert Clark Tanner, who was a philosophy professor here at the University of Utah, and went on to start the O.C. Tanner Company, which has sponsored these lectures since their inception. These lectures are given at 9 different universities around the world every year, and that was certainly in part to the generosity of Obert Tanner. Harvard University, Yale, Princeton, University of Michigan, Stanford, University of California, Berkeley, University of Oxford, and University of Cambridge. It's my honor every year to actually meet with those presidents and talk about the health and vibrancy of these lectures and to try to share, I think, insights from them to see what types of intellectual gifts we can bring to our campuses every year. In attendance tonight, we have Scott Sperry, who is the CEO of the O.C. Tanner Company. Scott, would you stand up? Could we give you a round of applause? Also, please stand up, Stephen Tanner Irish, who is the chairman of the board of the O.C. Tanner Company. We're also fortunate to have Stephen often active here on campus, and we appreciate all of your contributions. Anyway, tonight we will welcome David Damrosch, the Ernest Bernbaum Professor of Comparative Literature at Harvard University. And I want to now turn the time over to Scott Black, the director of our center, to make that introduction. Scott, please come to the stage.
Thank you, President Randall. I am very pleased to introduce Dr. David Damrosch, who will give the 47th Annual Tanner Lecture on Human Values. We are in a moment of upheaval. Many of the basic frameworks of the recent international order are being questioned, doubted, and re-examined. It's too soon to grasp the full consequences of the fast-moving changes being implemented, but some basic questions are being asked again about the relationship of culture to nation. Is culture national? Do we thrive as nations and individuals by rooting ourselves in our own cultures or by branching out to others? Can you do one without the other? The history of languages and literatures is central to the history of global exchange. Language enables communication, but is also a tool of conquest. Literature is an art of peace, but also an instrument of power. All conquests and all exercises of power, though, entail unintended consequences. Cultures are resilient, and great literature is formed of all aspects of our experience, from love and joy to violence and grief. The history of global literature is a story of surprising survivals as well as conquests, novel hybridities as well as repressive denials. Great works grow from the ashes of destroyed worlds and give unexpected shape to new ones. For the past 30 years, no one has done more to help us grasp and explore the complexities of world literature, and so our movements, confrontations, and creativity as a global species than David Damrosch. Dr. Damrosch is Ernest Bernbaum Professor of Comparative Literature at Harvard University and Director of the Institute for World Literature. He is author of many important scholarly monographs, including the field-defining works, What is World Literature?, How to Read World Literature, and the delightful Around the World in 80 Books. Among many others, Dr. Damrosch has also done important work on the Epic of Gilgamesh and recently translated Georges Ngal's powerful Congolese novel, Giambattista Vico, an important work of post-colonial French literature. Dr. Damrosch's extensive range of scholarly interests is matched by his important work as a leader in the field. He has served as president of the American Comparative Literature Association and was a founding general editor of the Longman Anthology of World Literature, as well as editor of numerous student-oriented textbooks, including Teaching World Literature and the Princeton Sourcebook in Comparative Literature. Appropriately, his work has been translated into Arabic, Chinese, Danish, Estonian, French, German, Italian, Japanese, Korean, Persian, Polish, Portuguese, Romanian, Spanish, Turkish, and Vietnamese. As will be apparent from this partial and selective summary of his work, Dr. Damrosch is a foundational and central figure in the contemporary study of world literature. He has influenced all of us who work in the field, as well as his many students and their students in turn, some of whom are here tonight and will be giving papers tomorrow. Dr. Damrosch's current project opens a new dimension to the study of world literature, examining the actual writing systems, the script worlds that make literature literature, a written form of art that is defined by the many writing scripts that record our languages and stories. Script worlds offer another way to think about the growth and movements of cultures. Like all cultural developments, the history of script worlds is a story of imperial domination and the displacement of local traditions, but also a story of how new, unexpected possibilities emerge from those encounters. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Damrosch to give this year's Tanner Lectures on Human Values. Tonight's lecture is the first of two Dr. Damrosch will present. The second is at noon tomorrow in the Gould Auditorium of the Marriott Library. It will be followed by a symposium featuring faculty members from the University of Utah and other universities who will further explore the history of script worlds in the context of East Asian literature and Middle Eastern literature. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David Damrosch.
Thank you so much for that very substantial introduction. Thank you, President Randall, and the whole everyone for this very, very kind invitation. I'm really honored to be here following such a distinguished line of Tanner lectures here in other campuses, including my late Columbia colleague, Edward Said, who spoke about the need to not give up on seemingly lost causes. And here in Utah, my dissertation director, Jeffrey Hartman, 25 years ago, speaking on poetry and spirituality. It's a special pleasure to be speaking to you about scripts and cultural memory here in Utah, which is such a center of global evangelical outreach. World religions have always been a driving force in cultural connection and transformation, and specifically in the global spread of the Roman alphabet in many languages for Bible translations. One of the reasons I came to study world literature, in fact, was from growing up hearing about my parents' years as Anglican missionaries in the Philippines in the 40s and early 50s, before my father took up a parish in Maine, where I was born. The first words I heard in any language other than English were phrases that would crop up in my parents' conversation from the indigenous languages they'd learned in those years. As can be seen in this a prayer that my mother taped into her prayer book here, and you can see, interestingly, thanks to their Catholic predecessors, God is already Dios in this prayer, in this language that was first produced alphabetically for religious conversion purposes. As a preacher's kid, I grew up understanding literature as well as scripture as repositories of ethical values. One of my two brothers followed in our father's footsteps and became a parish priest, but it's not surprising that my other brother and I both became literature professors. Universities are prime venues for research and debate on human values, as they've been expressed over time and across cultures. And the university is both an engine of progress and a treasure house of cultural memory. This is well encapsulated in my very favorite university motto from Heidelberg, the future since 1386. In the half century since I first began studying literature, I would say we've made real progress, in addressing a variety of long-standing social ills, from racism to imperialism to sexism. But there's another ism that only seems to be growing, the presentism that so often leads us to neglect our history and the traditions that we have to renew and re-envision as we chart our path from 1776 or from 1386 to the future. I'll begin my talk, in fact, with a tale from the 1300s, which inspired my title today. Early in the Icelandic saga of Bosi and Haraldr, a young Swedish Viking, Bosi, kills his king's favorite son in a brawl. The king sentences Bosi to death, and there doesn't seem to be any hope for him. Fortunately, though, Bosi has the support of his foster mother, Busla, who is a sorceress. She goes to the king at night, and she declaims a poem threatening dire consequences if he carries out his sentence. Storms will tear his ships apart, his eyes will turn inside out, and stallions will use him for sex. Woe be to you, her poem concludes, unless you do my will. It's very interesting. Icelandic culture was predominantly oral, and women had a strong presence as poets, more than they would in a Latinate written culture where Latin was tended to be restricted to men. The frightened king agrees to let Bosi go into exile, but he says he'll kill him if he ever sees him again. Then I'll have to do you one better, says the sorceress. And the writer tells us she begins that verse, which is called Stirpa verse, which has the most powerful magic, and which is not allowed to be sung after sunset. He gives us the poem's riddling conclusion, which accompanies 6 runes that she shows to the king. Komi her seger sex, she says. The poem says, Seg tu mer nöffen thera öler bunden ekmun ther sinna. Gerti du egeradet, sva at mer thicki, da skulle thick hundar I helnjaga. And salthin sokva I viti. I imagine it's a very low, threatening voice, I don't know. So the hounds will gnaw him in hell, his soul will sink into the abyss if he doesn't get what the runes mean. The king is helpless in the face of this runic riddle, and he backs down. Now, Nordic runes each had a name based on their sound, just as Hebrew and other languages often do. And in principle, he shouldn't have had any trouble naming the runes and piecing together the message they were conveying. His problem, though, is that the sorceress has given her runes a cryptic set of names, known only to herself, so it's meaningless, the succession of letters that he sees to him. The saga's writer himself seems unnerved by her poem. As you see, after quoting the verse, he adds parenthetically, Her kom Rune, there must have been runes in his source, but he doesn't tell you what they are. He doesn't show them to us. He seems afraid people might still use them, perhaps even after sunset. As we'll see, medieval Iceland gives us a striking example of the complex cultural dynamics that can develop when a country changes from one script world to another. What led me to formulate the idea of script worlds was a map I came on some years ago when I was writing the book on Gilgamesh that Scott mentioned. Here you see all the places where finds of texts and artifacts are associated. So Gilgamesh is written here in southern Mesopotamia, Sumerian originally, but the Gilgamesh finds are everywhere from Susa in eastern western Persia, all the way up here, up into the Hittite capital, Bogashkoi, down in the Levant, all the way down to Megiddo, just north of Jerusalem, but not further south, not in Egypt. And I realized this was found everywhere that cuneiform is in daily use. It's the cuneiform script world that is circulated through, across several languages, a couple of thousand years, far beyond any one empire, any one country. Now, it's no wonder that it circulated so widely because it was used as a school text. You would practice your cuneiform with excerpts from Gilgamesh and other literary texts. No wonder, because Gilgamesh is everything that a canny instructor wants: sex, violence, and good vocab, the 3 things you most need. So what do we learn when we learn how to write? Then, or now, here, or there. Not just words on a page. It's an entire complex of practices, ideas about what writing is for, and a great deal of cultural information gets conveyed to us as we practice this skill. Writing was the first telecommunications system. It had the magical ability to convey meaning across time and space, and it soon became a prime index of identity and a bearer of cultural memory. The first writers realized with excitement that they could encapsulate the whole world. You see this especially in Egyptian. It's not just that they could put an animals and things. But these are just used as letters of the alphabet. That's an S, that's an M, that's a D, it's a T. Semitic just means to listen. But look how beautifully that owl is represented, or this chick over here, this vulture, which is just a glottal stop when it's used alphabetically. The world is there, and you can preserve someone's identity forever. This is a 5th dynasty tomb relief from about 2500 BCE, and it says that his name has been published and made to endure, or promoted, promulgated. His name is Itush, beautiful, lasting, alive. And not only can you be memorialized for eternity, but the passing moment can be memorialized. Here in another tomb relief, also I think 5th dynasty, this thief is trying to steal some goods here from this basket. He's been caught by the guard and the guard's dog Baboon. Up here you see what he's shouting back to the guard. It goes here right to left. And here I think this first word, the I, that's a letter I, the feather. The vulture, again, is like a glottal stop, like an aleph. And I think in this case, this should be translated as, "Yeah! Smite your baboon, get the baboon off me." That's what he's saying. Now, these papyri, these hieroglyphs had an enduring fascination, long after no one could read them anymore. Here we have one of the papyri that Joseph Smith purchased in 1835 or 37 when a traveling group came through. He bought a bunch of papyri and several mummies. Thanks to divine inspiration, he was able to read this, having never studied Egyptian. It was very new, it was beginning to be deciphered, and he determined by inspiration that this was actually entries made by Abraham and Joseph when they're in Egypt. That's what he determined that they were. It might look like the Book of the Dead, but no, this is what it was. Now, along with their religious uses, scripts spread widely through empire and became a way to promote your imperial power abroad. Here's a famous Code of Hammurabi. Here's in the British Museum, which would be impressive. There's a king receiving the law code that will be promulgated throughout his empire. Here are particularly notable cases. This is 200 feet above the valley floor at Behistun in western Persia, and Darius the Great is celebrating his conquest. Here he is, a bunch of subject kings being led to him, and all around cuneiform is proclaiming his greatness in 3 different languages in cuneiform script. And it was this that enabled the first linguist to begin to decipher cuneiform. It was the equivalent of the Rosetta Stone for him. So now scripts could convey your power around the world, and more portably, much more easily than the magnificent structures you might build at home. But not everyone wanted to join the imperial parade. The great scholar George Steiner, 50 years ago, wrote a book called After Babel, in which he says, "The outwardly communicative, extrovert thrust of language is secondary. The primary drive is inward and domestic. Each tongue hoards the resources of consciousness, the word pictures of the clan," especially nice for hieroglyphics, I would say. "And language builds a wall around the middle kingdom of the group's identity." Here he's thinking of China. "It is secret towards the outsider and inventive of its own world. There have been so many thousands of human tongues, there still are, because there have been so many distinct groups intent on keeping from one another the inherited singular springs of their identity and engaged in creating their own semantic worlds, their alternatives." Especially like the fact that the German translation is in reverse, as though it's being written in Semitic, right to left direction. Now, what he says about language applies equally to scripts. The Israelites resisted, in fact, assimilation by sticking with their own very local, unimperial script versus the glories of cuneiform or hieroglyphics. And the story of the Tower of Babel, which Steiner uses as his title image, is really about this, among other things. "Come, let us go down," they say up in heaven, to confuse the language of the impious Babylonians who are building this tower, so they will not understand each other. That is why it's called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them over the face of the earth. Now this is often read as a story of loss and dispossession, a melancholy story, but it's not. It is an item of resistance literature. It's explaining why the Hebrews don't have to get with the program of cuneiform, of Babylonian culture. And they do this through a satiric fake etymology, that Babel comes from the word to confuse, balal. Now, it's obvious to anyone speaking Akkadian, as they would, or even Aramaic, that it comes from Bab Ili, meaning the gate of God, which is the ziggurat for Marduk. To this day, Bab means like door in Arabic. Ili, you recognize Elohim, it's the word for God, perfectly understandable. But they pretend it comes from this word balal, to confuse. But they are so confused they even get the word confusion wrong, because instead of writing Beth Lamed Lamed, by mistake they wrote Beth Lamed, two B's instead of two L's. So the imperial center of Mesopotamia gets its name from Hebrew, from a scribal error in transcribing Hebrew. This makes me very happy, I have to say. Now, in keeping to their language and its local script, the Israelites could preserve their distinct cultural identity and stay loyal to their traditions and to their real or invented memories of the patriarchs and the glorious reigns of David and Solomon. Yet eventually, even they began to shift outward, first into Aramaic, very common spoken language all around, and then into Greek. Hence the translation, the Jewish translation of the Bible into Greek, the Septuagint, made for Greek-speaking Jews around 250 BCE. By this means, the Hebrew Bible could spread to the wider world, not in Hebrew, but in Greek. Otherwise, the rising world religion of Christianity would have left it behind. St. Paul was deeply grounded in Hebrew. He could preach equally in Greek and Aramaic, but he wrote only in Greek. Aramaic has a lingering presence in the Greek New Testament, just a handful of words or names. The only time we find a real full sentence in Aramaic comes with Jesus' last words on the cross, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which provide a vivid example of the fragility of cultural memory in the transition from one script world to another. The first two Gospels give it in one or another variant version, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, and then they translate it into Greek, Hotheosmo, Hotheosmo, este ankatelepes me, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Luke, third Gospel written, doesn't give it. Something completely different, much more comforting. Father, into thy hands I commit my spirit. The last Gospel, John, doesn't even do that, just it's completed. Now, if I ask my students, so what do they make of this? They tend to think, well, it's, Jesus is having a moment of truly human. His humanity comes out in full force, and his just existential dread in that moment. Now, that's a very existentialist reading, but Matthew and Mark could not possibly have thought that. In fact, there's ample evidence. They think very differently. Jesus calmly explains to his distraught disciples he has to go through this to do his Father's will. There's no question about it. There's no dread about that. It can't possibly be. So what do they have in mind when they quote this? And then they translate it into Greek. Well, they know that Jesus himself is quoting. It's the beginning of Psalm 22, Psalm 21, verse 2. Hotheosmo, Hotheosmo, proxesesmo hinate interkelipes me. My God, attend to me. Why have you forsaken me? The only difference between Matthew and Mark is that Mark gives it in the straight Aramaic, and Matthew gives the Hebrew version, Eli, Eli, probably because then it works better with the people thinking Jesus is calling for Elijah. So that's what it has. So now, if you get the reference, as any properly trained Jew would at the time, you know that's the psalm, and you know that the psalm immediately goes towards total confidence in God's deliverance in a time of trouble. It's as if in conversation we say to someone, a stitch in time, everyone knows, saves not. That's what follows. But Luke is writing for a mixed population. He addresses the Acts of the Apostles to a Greek-speaking convert, Theophilus, lover of God. It's more Greek than Hebrew, his audience. And he can't count on people getting the reference and not being thrown by it the way my students still are, thinking this is early Kierkegaard, which hardly was. But now Luke is still very sensitive to the biblical context. He knows it's a Bible quote. So what does he do? He simply gives us a different psalm, Psalm 31. Lord, into your hands I will place my spirit, just changing Lord into Father. So it's the same effect, but it doesn't confuse you if you don't know what the reference is. The line by itself sounds fine, right? Several decades later, writing for a completely Greek audience, John dispenses with psalms altogether, just cuts to the chase. It is completed, tetelestai. That's all he needs to tell us. So as a general matter, we learn a lot about our culture when we learn how to write. and a change of culture, of script, of cultural world, you're always in danger of losing the fine connection, even though the Hebrew Bible becomes part of what Harold Bloom called that captive text, the Old Testament, through translation into Greek and then into Latin. Even so, you lose the sort of close connection that you had with the original. But if you're learning how to write, and especially if you're learning a foreign script, a script that comes to you from another time and place, you learn a lot about a foreign culture. Learning how to write is the foundation of primary education, and a lot of literary material comes to us in the process. To give a couple of American examples, and you can see the very widely popular, often varied and reprinted New England Primer from 18th century. You're learning the alphabet through little rhymes based on biblical stories, right? Job feels the rod, it blesses God, proud Korah's troops were swallowed up, and so on. A century later, it's not going to be so much the Bible, but it's British nursery rhymes. Jack and Jill went up the hill. So you're getting all this material, in either case, something local or American, but a foreign text coming in. As one commentator has noted, throughout the 18th century, in terms of the New England Primer, perhaps more than any other book except the Bible, contributed to the molding of America and its institutions. Now, both these primers are teaching the alphabet primarily through poetry, one drawing on biblical history, the other on nursery rhymes. So too, even the Utopian alphabet, commissioned by Brigham Young and published in the early years of what is now this university, the Deseret first book published by the Regents of Deseret in 1868. And you can see how it's picking up the iconography of your typical primer, the mother teaching the son and daughter, like that. But this is now the alphabet at the sort of utopian, and it's utopian alphabet. It's meant to be worldwide. Anyone should be able to use it equally. That's the idea. It's a script version of Esperanto being promoted. And once again, they're practicing this in this most local case with British nursery rhymes. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. Everywhere, in fact, that I've looked, illustrated primary school texts contribute to the formation of national character. And sometimes they can change alarmingly with changing times. Once the Nazis came to power in Germany, there was a new edition of Mein Buch, the most popular primer in Germany from the 20s, for looking, drawing, reading, and writing. The author of Mein Kampf now has his portrait as a frontispiece to Mein Buch, and some of the illustrations inside change as well. Pretty creepy. Now, political revolutions can often involve revolutions in scripts. As with the Turkish language reform in the 1920s, this scholar describes it as a catastrophic success because of the loss of cultural heritage, wholesale loss, that came with abandoning the Ottoman Arabic alphabet, the linguistic purification, taking out Arabic and Persian words from Turkish, and just leaving behind a whole millennial tradition, shifting towards the Western European future that they were seeing. Scripts can feature as battlegrounds in conflicts of all kinds, which we'll be discussing tomorrow, where particularly the Palestine-Israel-Gaza conflict and the Ukrainian conflict I'll be talking about in particular, among some other examples tomorrow. In the balance of my talk today, I'd like to take up two fascinating examples of what happened when the Roman alphabet spread to new parts of the world, displacing the writing systems that had been in place before. I'm going to look first at colonial New Spain, Nueva España, which included Utah, at least in theory, and then return to medieval Iceland. Now, the circumstances in these two transitions are interesting because they're quite different. One imposed by conquistadores, the other in Iceland more or less chosen by choice in the wake of, in connection with conversion to Christianity, and a general wish to kind of become part of continental culture. But there's a certain commonality in both these different cases. The imported culture of writing poses a profound danger to the cherished religious beliefs and the rich literary traditions that the New World Order is going to displace. At the same time, the new technology gave native writers new opportunities to preserve and develop their traditions in much fuller and more lasting ways than their mostly oral traditions had been before. The alphabet comes to Mesoamerica as a result of conquest in the 1520s with the conversion in its wake. A group of friars is coming very early on. In this early text from the 1550s, we see two nobles of the Mixtec group looking on in awe at this very large Dominican friar with his portable writing desk and his sort of hat. His friar's hat is on the floor there. And so their names are written above them, 10 rabbit and seven deer. In another portrait from Tlaxcala, the allies of Cortez are celebrating the Aztec's defeat, and they almost get it right. So here you have Cortez. Here you have La Malinche, his forced native wife and interpreter. Juan de Aligar, a Spanish guy who knew Mayan and Nahuatl and served as the intermediary between them. He's got an eagle to signify his name. So it almost gets right. Ikpalique Mexica, here the Mexica surrendered, except this should be a U. It's written upside down, turns into an N. So almost got the alphabet right, just not quite. The older books were beautiful. They had books, these screenfold books, most of which the Spaniards destroyed because they thought they had idols and devils in them. As you see, they're very lovely. This is one of the few surviving ones called the Dresden Codex, but they're mostly just calendrical, astronomical, bare bones history, just facts and sort of keywords. One scholar has said they're really a lot like handouts that are used in lectures. They just give you talking points, key things. They're not a full narrative. The Popol Vuh is the greatest Mayan compilation of ancient traditions, telling of their early history, with lively tales of doings among the gods in heaven and on the underworld, and the early history of mankind. It was based on some earlier pictographic book that would have looked something like that, which is now lost, but it never would have fleshed out the tales so fully. So what we have that survived is this text written in the Roman alphabet with a Spanish translation by a friar who got very interested in it. That's what was able to survive. This key compendium of cultural memory was written just 30 years after the conquest in Guatemala, but it's already getting infused with foreign cultural memories brought into Mesoamerica by the friars who were teaching the natives to read and write. And these are memories that the indigenous peoples are already starting to adopt for themselves. The central episode concerns the scattering of the Mayan tribes from Yucatan Peninsula and the exodus of the Quiche people across the Caribbean to their new home in highland Guatemala. And we're told of them, the Quiche could no longer understand one another clearly when they came away from Tulan. Alas, they say, we've left our language behind. How did we do it? We're lost. Where were we deceived? We had only one language when we came to Tulan. We had only one place of emergence and origin. We haven't done well, said all the tribes. It isn't clear how they crossed over the sea. They crossed over as if there were no sea. Where the waters divided, they crossed over. So the waters part to allow them to reach their new homeland? Now you might think I'm overreading if I see echoes here of the Tower of Babel and the Exodus from Egypt across the Red Sea. But then compare the account in a related text, the title of the Lords of Totonicapán. It's another Guatemalan city, maybe 100 miles away from the Quiche capital. And their authors are making the case for their right to retain their ancestral lands. And what they say is about this story, when they arrived at the edge of the sea, their leader, Balam Kitse, touched it with his staff, and at once the path opened, which then closed up again. For thus the great God wished it to be done, because they were sons of Abraham and Jacob. 1554. They've obviously heard the Spaniards speculating that the Indians must be the lost tribes of Israel, a theory that later entered Mormon doctrine. So they assert that if they are the lost tribes, then they know who gave them their promised land. Like the Maya, the Aztecs and their neighbors in central Mexico found that the new writing technology enabled them to record and elaborate their poetry and tales far more capaciously than ever before. Here's a page from an important poetry collection in our alphabet known as the Cantares Mexicanos. And here what I really like, here's the heading for the next poem. It just says, Nicanampewa Tepanisquicatl. Here begins a log drum song. But just look at that flourish on the end, like here. It's on the page. It's here. All kinds of poems are in there. Here's a verse from one of them, a remarkable one, which shows this poet's first encounter with the radically foreign culture when Hernán Cortés took a group of Aztec noblemen to meet Pope Clement VII in Rome in 1529. Friends, the poet says, willow men, behold the Pope, who's representing God, who speaks for him. The Pope is on God's mat and seat and speaks for him. Who is this reclining in a golden chair? Look, it's the Pope. He has his turquoise blowgun, and he's shooting in the world. I grieve in Rome and see him in the flesh, and he's San Pedro, San Pablo. He said, what do I need? Gold. Everybody bow down, call out to God in excelsis. Well, Pope Clement probably wasn't sitting on God's mat shooting darts from a turquoise blowgun, but this was a way to convey his power to the audience back home. And almost certainly there was an illustrated manuscript showing this, to say, look, you see it, but that's lost, but now you have the actual poem. Now, Cantares Mexicanas is the opening text in a collection made in the 1550s for instructional use, both for native students to learn how to write Nahuatl and also for the friars to learn about native traditions so they could understand better their new flocks. The manuscript that begins with Cantares ends with a set of animal fables, and the animal fables are translated from Aesop from Latin. The riddle discourse is composed by the wise man Flamatini named Aesop, starting with a story called Qua Quatenzone Yehan Coyotl, the bearded goat and the coyote. Now, that story by Aesop was actually about a fox and a goat. An appropriate trickster. Foxes are tricksy, like Rune the Fox is a whole tradition that we have in the West. But the foxes, they had foxes in Mexico, but they apparently were not so famous as tricksters, whereas coyote tales were widely spread throughout the Southwest and Mexico. Coyotes are so native to the region that a very name for them comes from the Nahuatl, coyotl. So our indigenous writer performed a threefold metamorphosis, going Ovid to better, at once biological, cultural, and linguistic. What had been a European fable has become a Native American coyote tale, even as its authorship is still ascribed to the Tlamatini Aesopo. To this day, indigenous languages are often taught to kids through imported literature. The literature may change. Then it was Aesop, now it's the Little Prince. And this is one of 11 different Mexican languages in which you can now practice your writing of Totonac. This is Totonac, and then there's Nahuatl and Mayan and 7, 8 others. Now, if we return to medieval Iceland, we can see what happens when a country makes a relatively free choice to change from one script to another. They were under some pressure from the King of Norway, but they were almost 1,000 miles away. Norway could not invade them. They didn't have the ability to do that. So it was general pressure, and they ended up deciding, the Icelanders, to adopt Christianity in the year 1000 after a series of conversion attempts by a majority vote at their annual assembly, the Althing, after an extended debate on the pros and cons of their new faith. So they made this choice by vote, democratically, and it didn't immediately displace the culture. It was a gradual process over about 3 centuries. Runes had long been used in Scandinavia, but almost entirely just for inscriptions and brief messages. Here's a couple of examples. A little stick of wood from a tavern in Bergen. Gita segrat to got heim. Gita says you got home again. Or they found a slipper, one of 2 slippers that was embroidered with these runes in Latin. Mulil, probably the girl's name. Amor vincit omnia et, love conquers all. And the other slipper must have had the end of the line from Virgil's Eclogue, Nos quedamos amore, let us all yield to love. I won't speculate on the woman's employment at the tavern, but anyway, she was certainly a good time girl, liking the party at the tavern. So runes were cut into sticks of wood and carved on stone. They'd never been used to write extended texts. Poetry and tales were created and transmitted orally. Interestingly, runes figure frequently in the old poetry, inscriptions often associated with magic. Runes had a special connection to Odin, the god of wisdom, who had given poetry to humanity in the form of an intoxicating mead, the mead of poetry. In a long poem called Sayings of the High One, a name for Odin, we learn that he hung wounded on the world ash tree, Yggdrasil, which holds together heaven, earth, and the underworld, for 9 nights to learn the secret of runes. And I quote, I took up the runes, screaming, I took them. Then I fell back from there. Then I began to quicken and grow wise. He instructs his listener, the runes you must find in meaningful letters, very great letters, very stiff letters, which the mighty sage colored, the huge powers made, and the rune master of the gods carved out. He goes on to describe 18 different runes, a kind of alphabet of his own, that give power in a wide variety of circumstances, from blunting an enemy's weapons, to making someone fall in love with you, to bringing a corpse back to life. I can so carve and color the runes, he says, that the man walks and talks with me. The Icelanders had never been in the habit of writing down their poems and their sagas, but when missionaries fanned out across northern Europe in the 10th and 11th centuries, along with their Bibles, they brought a new conception of the importance of written records and a new technology for creating them. Though the poets continued their proud tradition of oral composition, The Roman alphabet and its associated media of ink and parchment gave them new opportunities to record their poetry and to disseminate it. Thus, in the early 1220s, Snorri Sturluson, the greatest Icelandic writer of his generation, sought to cement his relationship with Norway's King Haakon IV, almost 1,000 miles away. And so he composed a 100-stanza poem praising the king and his earls. He sent his poem by ship, something he could never have done before. He wrote sagas as well as poetry, and he compiled the prose Edda, the treatise on poetry and poetics, in which he included poems and tales to explain the many mythic references and metaphors or kennings used in Norse poetry. The prose Edda and the Icelandic poems and sagas are not part of Latin literature, and yet they're very much a part of the Latin script world. Yet the Icelanders weren't content to adopt the Roman alphabet just as it came to them. Instead, they decided that a written literature of their own should be conveyed in an alphabet of their own, better suited to the sounds of their language. And so a series of grammarians analyzed the phonetic structure of Old Norse and debated how best to adapt the Roman alphabet for their needs. In the process, they remade the Roman alphabet into a distinctly national system. This perspective is explicit in the work of an anonymous writer who composed Iceland's first grammatical treatise in around 1150. This is the final page of the treatise. If you look at the set of letters he lists at the bottom, you might think, well, it's mostly just the Roman letters, plus a thorn, a th, just with a bunch of accents on it. But that's not what the grammarian says. Far from considering these giving into foreign ways, he asserts that Iceland requires its own alphabet, just as the Hebrews have, the Greeks have, and the Romans have, and he is stepping in to fill this need. I have written an alphabet for us Icelanders also, he tells us. And the treatise goes on to explain why that is. He describes how he has accepted some Latin letters, rejected others, and invented new letter forms as needed, especially for vowels, since he says our language has the greatest number of vowel sounds. His innovations may seem like mere hair splitting. To give two examples, who really cares whether the alphabet shows if a consonant is short or long, or whether the word ern, which means iron, is given one syllable or two? Well, the answer is poets care. If you were hearing a poem being recited, you would simply hear the difference. Not so if you're reading words on a page. The first grammarian believed that the lyric poetry, the skaldic poetry, is the highest form of language, and the one most in need of precision in rhythm and pronunciation. As he says right after he discusses the need to recognize split diphthongs, the skalds, the poets, are authorities on all writing or speaking, just like craftsmen on their craft and lawyers on the law. All told, in place of the scanty 5 vowels in the impoverished Latin alphabet, the first grammarian comes up with 18. Yet even he realizes that his alphabetic exuberance has to have some limits. He devotes a paragraph to the letter Z, which would rarely be needed in Icelandic, but he says, I prefer to reject it from our language and alphabet, since there are of necessity more letters already than I care to have. The first grammarian closes his treatise with a note of encouragement or a challenge. Nu man ritat will, and I skip down to here, hafista frafleta her aratha ritat, unsan verda der hanam likar better, unless you get one that he likes better. Perhaps he really is inviting his reader to come up with such an alphabet, but I think he's writing this with one hand on his axe. Snorri's Edda shows the importance of literature as a bearer of cultural memory in the context of education and literacy. Written in the mid-1200s, the Edda survives in 4 manuscripts in the 1300s, always bound together with one or more of the 4 grammatical treatises, this one and 3 others, later ones. The Edda was both transmitted and also reshaped within this context. And Snorri realized that the poetic traditions he loved were profoundly threatened by the new order, by the script as much as the scriptures. Seeking to preserve the old lore, Snorri made his Edda into the single greatest medieval compendium of Germanic myths and legends, focused on the Norse gods, the Aesir. The Edda opens with a 75-page section called the Gylfaginning, or Deluding of Gylfi, in which a Swedish king ventures to the Aesir's stronghold, Asgard, to learn the secret of their origins and their power. Gylfi's visit to Asgard doesn't require a heavenly journey, as Snorri asserts that the Aesir are actually great heroes from Turkey, who have been settling in the north. Snorri even gives this history an etymological grounding. He suggests that the god's very name, the Aesir, derived from Asia. And he adds that throughout northern Europe, their language, that of the men of Asia, became the native tongue in all these lands. Gylfi's many questions are answered by a deceptive trinity named Har, Jafnhar, and Thridi, high one, just as high, and third. All three names, in fact, are epithets for Odin, who sort of triplicated himself in disguise, in Trinitarian disguise. Quite interesting. The trio describe the world's creation, the gods' adventures, their struggles against giants and other hostile forces that one day will culminate in Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. As Snorri declares, these things have now to be told to young poets who desire to learn the language of poetry and to furnish themselves with a wide vocabulary using traditional terms. Then let such a one take this book as scholarly inquiry and entertainment. But these stories are not to be consigned to oblivion or demonstrated to be false, so as to deprive poetry of ancient kennings, which major poets have been happy to use. Clearly, Snorri is aware that there were priests who wanted to consign such false stories to oblivion. A committed Christian himself, he defends them not on the ground of truth, but for their poetic value. In Snorri's day, the literary field was being further transformed with the introduction of courtly writing from the continent, as dangerous as the dictates of Rome were the attractions of Paris. Snorri's Edda shows a deep awareness of the precariousness of the skaldic tradition, the poetic tradition. In a prologue to his book, he describes the growth of the human race after the deluge in terms of material gain, but also a memory loss. He says when their numbers had grown and they had settled throughout the world, the majority of mankind loved worldly desires and ambition. They abandoned their obedience to God, going so far they no longer desired to name God. Who then was able to tell their sons about God's wondrous deeds? Thus they lost God's name, and nobody could be found anywhere in the world who knew his maker. Snorri is supposedly talking about the ancients who lost God's name and fell into paganism, yet his book is precisely devoted to telling young poets about the marvels performed by Odin and the other gods whose names are being boycotted under Christianity. Then again, the gods were always aware of their mortality. The Greeks had seen the sun, for example, as a chariot of the immortal Apollo, god of poetry, prophecy, and reason, but we learn differently in the Edda. The visiting King Gylfi remarks that the sun moves quickly. It is almost as though she fears something. She couldn't go faster, even if she were afraid of her own death. High One replies the sun's haste isn't surprising. She's being pursued by Skur, a gigantic wolf. He frightens her, and eventually he will catch her, High One says. Another wolf will catch the moon. The sky will split asunder, the earth will burn up, and the gods will meet their doom. So the gods always knew their days were numbered, even if they didn't realize that the number would be quite so short. After telling Gylfi all about the old gods, High One declares with a touch of impatience, if you know how to ask questions still further in the future, then I don't know the point of your questions. I've never heard of anyone who could tell events of the world farther into the future. May you find use in what you have learned. Suddenly the entire fortress vanishes, leaving Gylfi standing on an empty plain. He left, Snorri says, and traveled back home to his kingdom, where he told of the events he had seen and what he'd heard. After him, people passed these stories down from one to another, orally, and now he's going to, for the first time, write them. In his account of the Twilight of the Gods, Snorri quotes extensively from an old pagan poem called Voluspa, but he doesn't mention two details there concerned with writing. The poem says that during their shadowy afterlife, following Ragnarok, the gods discuss the ancient runes of Odin. Then Rune, god of silence, takes a strip of wood to carve with prophetic runes before they'll construct a new hall. Neither detail appears in Snorri's account. There are no runes in this new heaven, it seems. Unwritten oral traditions will always die out in time. When the author of the saga Bos and Haraldr declines to give us that sorceress's full poem, he first tells us, I must not let it be written here because it's useless to anyone who repeats it. But then he adds what must be his real reason. It is not likely to be repeated if it is not written. Oral traditions will die out if they're forgotten just for a single generation. But a written text can long outlast the world of its origin. And so, as Snorri realized, the magic of the runic world could be preserved and disseminated in our alphabet, or as the first grammarian would insist, in his alphabet. 700 years after Snorri was murdered by a rival chieftain, his Edda would become an inspiration for the best-selling novel of the 20th century, The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien's Middle-earth takes many features from Norse myth. The very names of Gandalf and several of the dwarves come directly from Snorri's Edda. Their runes appear as early as the title page, where it's simply transliterated English. It's not in any other language, but it says The Lord of the Rings translated from the Red Book of Westmarch by Tolkien, and down here in the Elvish script that he invented, here is set forth the history of the war, as seen by the hobbits. So not only is it there, but now if you want, you can write with both scripts on keyboards produced by drop.com. I particularly like the witty way the return key is done here. It's the sword of Anduil, which of course reforged for the return of the king. Pretty good. As Snorri sits up in Valhalla today, drinking his mead and playing chess with his fellow poets, he must be pleased. So to sum up, writing systems profoundly shape people's worldviews and the ways we make sense of our experience. They do so not because of some mystical quality of a single sign system, but because scripts are never learned in a vacuum. Instead, a writing system is a centerpiece of an extended program of education and employment. In learning a script, people absorb key elements of a literary history and its terms of reference, often transcending that of any one language or country. In adopting a foreign script and its associated material practices, writers can gain new connections to the wider world and new creative possibilities. Yet, as we'll see tomorrow, writing systems and the languages they convey can also become flashpoints in bitter disputes over territory, identity, and history. Our human values are intimately bound up with the ways we preserve our traditions and renew them in a shifting and conflictual world, and much can be lost in the process. Successful as he was in negotiating his culture's position within the Latin script world, Snorri Sturluson remained acutely aware of the precarity of the traditions he loved. At one point in his Edda, Snorri quotes an old poem that describes two ravens that Odin always keeps with him, Hugin and Munin, whose name mean thought and memory. Two ravens sit on Odin's shoulders, and into his ears they tell all the news they see or hear. Their names are Hugin, thought, and Munin, memory. At sunrise, he sends them off to fly throughout the whole world, and they return in time for the first meal. Thus he gathers knowledge about many things that are happening, and so people call him the raven god, as is said. Hugin och Munin flyga färjan tack, jorman grunt ufer. They fly over the wide world. Umkak Hugin at han aptene komme. I fear for thought he may not come back. Those shamkek mer at Munin. But I'm more afraid for memory. The raven that Noah sent out from the ark couldn't find anything to bring back to him, but his dove returned with an olive leaf, showing that life after the deluge could resume. Odin's ravens bring back news of the wide world, time for breakfast, but not of the future. Odin is the god of wisdom, and he is blessed and cursed with foreknowledge, fyrirhyggja. He knows that he can only use the raven's reports for a time, until the gods enter their fated twilight and fade from memory. One day Munin will fail to return. Yet Odin is also the god who brought the meat of poetry to mankind, and perhaps he foresees the day when Icelanders will adopt and adapt the script brought by the new dispensation that will displace him. Resisting the oblivion threatened by the advancing culture, their poets will use the new script to celebrate their former patron and his marvelous deeds, and their writings will keep alive the memory of the raven named Memory. Thank you. I have an incompetence in reading 12. I can only get along in about 4 with varying degrees of incompetence. So it's an advantage of studying particularly older materials. Often when I was in college, I used to claim that my major was necrolinguistics because I worked so much in dead languages. So, I mean, I wish that I had more ability, more competence. And I will say that my utopian dream when I teach a world literature course is that every student unpredictably will discover they need to study a language they never knew they wanted to learn until they fall in love with something, which they're going to have to do in translation if they're not a heritage speaker. This happened to me with Nahuatl in a freshman art history course, the first year, it was a great, core curriculum course, whole series. The instructor in the art history course happened to be a Mesoamericanist, and he smuggled in a week on Aztec and Mayan stuff into what's otherwise purely European art history. And I decided to write my little term paper on an amazing statue of this goddess Coatlicue in the Museo Nacional de Antropología. And to try to figure out what this iconography meant, I looked around. It wasn't serious research. As a freshman, it was a short paper. But I found this book by a guy named Miguel Leon Portilla called Aztec Thought and Culture. And he quotes a lot from the poetry to try to understand the thought world of the Aztec Empire. So I was reading English translation of it, Spanish translation of the Nahuatl original, and I still thought, this is amazing. I'd never heard anything like it, and the names especially. So as it had been so Koyokyukwi, so it's in by Xochitl, we come to this earth not to live, only to dream. Amazing poems. I thought if I ever get the chance, I'm going to study Nahuatl. 4 years later in graduate school, I found a course being offered in the anthropology department, because no literature department was ever touching this. My director of graduate studies, Bart Chamati, who later became president of Yale and head of the National Baseball League, threatened to defenestrate me when I asked for permission. It was on the 8th floor of the building, but he did let me take it. So I studied for a while the Nahuatl, and from that I realized that I needed to learn Spanish, because you just can't work on material without the Spanish. In my high school, my parochial school in New York, where Spanish was being spoken on the street, you could not study Spanish. It was not offered in school. It was Latin, French, and German, the very 3 languages I had to pass language exams in as a first-year graduate student in Comp Lit. This shows how ancient this was. So ironically, because of 1 week in a first-year art history course studying Nahuatl, I then studied Spanish, so that now I can teach Cervantes with reference to the original, thanks to that chain. So actually, I had to learn 2 languages as a result of 1 encounter with some poetry. And I hope that will happen for everybody. And I will say that for me, for literary purposes, just a basic reading knowledge is already a qualitative difference. So you're not totally the prisoner of a translation. You can look at the original. So even if you can't, go and talk to people and know, which is much better if you can, but already it's worth a lot to get a basic knowledge. Thank you. Uh, More a blessing than a curse. A blessing if it's used well, and a curse if it's used badly. And that's probably true of the sources as runes too. Google Translate is wonderfully effective for, say, translating a scholarly article, getting a gist of something. It is not now, and probably will never be very good for really literary translation, because any good literary translation is an interpretation. And we don't yet have the AI intelligence that can actually interpret a text. It can produce something bland. And even if you look at the AI-generated literature so far, it's really embarrassingly poor. So I think Google Translate is great as a starting point, but it cannot replace serious interpretation and serious literary translation.
Thank you. A wonderful talk, provocative and wide-ranging. I'm curious if you're familiar with the work of the linguist Roy Harris, and in particular his book on the origin of writing. He taught at Oxford for many years. Do you know his work?
No.
It's an absolutely amazing book that had a huge impact on me when I read it. It sort of hit me like a thunderbolt, where he talks about writing as less than a system of communication than a system of inscription and information storage. And it seems to have all sorts of implications for notions of cultural transfer and so on that are too complicated to try to work out in 30 seconds. But I'm sure you're familiar with this kind of theory of the history of writing as growing out of accounting, basically. Yeah. And he takes that to certain kinds of logical extremes and suggests that the function and structure and purpose of writing in culture is very, very different from that of spoken language, that it's another language function, and he sort of tries to pry them apart in fascinating ways. And if you don't know Harris, I can see you, obviously you know a great deal about this, and I'm just sort of curious.
And is he talking about the Republic of Georgia, the Georgian alphabet, did you say?
No, he talks about the writing in general across multiple systems. He looks at rebuses and hieroglyphs and cuneiform and the Ashango bone and the whole range, and comes up and very critically looks at the Crito and Rousseau and takes them apart and says, this mythology of writing systems as imitations of speech has led to all sorts of mischief. And well, I'll throw it out there as a softball for you and hit away. Thank you.
No, it's very, very complicated. I definitely have to look him up. Yeah, there's on the one hand, you can say that they are really qualitatively different, but you can also say there's been too much of a artificial division. Either you have orality or you have written text. And for a very long time, written texts were meant to be read aloud. That was the purpose of reading. Even Dickens is writing in order to be read in the family circle at night in a internet, pre-TV, pre-radio era. So both things can be true. And of course, Dickens harmed his health he couldn't resist performing his texts for large audiences. So as writerly, a writer, as a Victorian novelist, is still writing very with his ear in mind. Writing certainly serves multiple purposes. In the ancient Near East, the three centers in Mesopotamia of writing are either temples, courts, or business, merchant homes. That's where you'd have libraries. And there are those three kinds of purposes. And of course, even accounting itself is closely connected to economic development and especially imperial spread. So in ancient Egypt, you have a whole discussion about how Horus and Seth, there's Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, and they're merged together to form the United Kingdom about 5,000 years ago. And there are texts talking about this and how Horus and Seth, that symbolizes reed and papyrus coming together, and that's what you need to write with. So I do think they're different in kind, and I mean, I absolutely think that, for example, doing a lecture, I'm reflecting to now publish one of these. Every sentence I have to rewrite. I mean, it's a different medium altogether. And so what's so interesting about a case like the Icelandic one is that they never thought that writing would be beneficial. They could have written with runes, it's just sort of awkward, but why would you want to? And I'm sure that the first people who saw texts of Homer thought, what is this graphesis, things on a page? I mean, if you, in the Odyssey, when Demodocus, the leader of the people, the bard, is performing story from the Iliad, it's got music, it's got a whole floor show of dancing boys. I mean, why would you reduce it to just marks on a page? So I really do think there was a long and very varied sort of rivalry between the two, and that's one of the things that the history of scripts certainly encompasses.
Hello. Thank you so much for your talk. I learned a lot. So this country, our nation, we hold so many languages, so many cultural memories. I'm wondering about your thoughts on our president making English the official language of the country. If you think that harms our cultural memory as a nation, or if you have any thoughts on that.
Yes, I have a few thoughts on that. I should say, I mean, I teach up at Art. My wife teaches at the Columbia Law School, and we compare notes every day. Who has been harmed more today by the administration? I mean, there is my guidance for this. There's a really good book by a linguist named David Crystal from 20 years ago called English as a Global Language. I recommend it. It's a short book, very smart, and he talks about why it is that English is just completely different from Latin. I think the global spread because of economic than true globalization. But Crystal is also a Welsh activist, and he says it would be the greatest tragedy if people spoke only English. And what his advocacy is everyone should speak their homegrown language and this very convenient lingua franca. And that's my position too. So it doesn't actually bother me at all to say a country could have an official language, as long as that doesn't mean repressing the study of other languages. So it all depends on what it means. And of course, well, I'll talk tomorrow. I mean, it goes at every level. You might think, for example, that Switzerland has now 4 official languages, French, German, Italian, and Romansh, which is spoken by 0.5% of the population in Eastern Switzerland. For a long time, it was not allowed to be an official language. Now it's an official language, so that's better. but there's now a common orthography for Romansh, and you might think, oh, great, now we've got our own language. But boy, it's really hated by a bunch of the speakers of Romansh because, in fact, for them, there's 5 different Romanshes, and they don't want to be imprisoned within one common one. So, this whole question of an official language is very complicated. At the same time, I mean, I agree that everyone. I think everyone should in the United States, I think, become really fluent in English. In Germany, they should be fluent in German, and there should be very active learning of other languages, including not only the heritage language, but you should learn other people's languages too. In teaching my world literature class a few years ago at Harvard, a student, a sophomore, got up and said, would I mind if he recited a poem by Hafiz? It was a week on Persian poetry by Hafiz. He recited from memory. So, great. This kid was from the Dominican Republic, and he had just fallen in love with Persian and was now memorizing Hafiz. And he's eloquent in English, and he's not forgotten his Spanish. And this, to me, is the model for what we should have.